everybody, Dana Litwin here again, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips for Leaders of Volunteers. Today, talking about background checks. I happen to have a pretty great background check here on the California coast. Hopefully you can see that little sailboat back there. But talking about background checks for volunteers and how those can be barriers to really great people not joining your team and your work and your organization, and when they are effective as one of hopefully many safety tools or policies or protocols that your agency has to screen both volunteers and ideally paid employees in the same way. So I happen to have worked in my career quite a bit with agencies that are a government agency or a state special district or a county government agency. And I've also worked with many organizations, in fact, most of them, where we have some sort of contact or we're giving regular services to either elderly, potentially vulnerable populations that are often targets of harm or harassment or scams. And also I've worked with agencies designing educational programs for kids and families and all ages, and working with youth and after school programs and things like that. So I've done a lot of creating these policies and programs and kind of safety measures, usually along with any legal representation, legal team, or legal department that the organization has, and also aligning with the HR, human resources, or other operational departments, just so that the policies are all in line from department to department. And we really want to make sure there isn't like a separate onerous screening process just for volunteers that is unwelcoming, or again, to my earlier point, creates a barrier that doesn't need to be there. So the main thing with background checks is who and why. Which volunteer roles are you wanting to have background checks as the onboarding or screening process? And typically the most common practice is anytime volunteers and or paid employees are working with children or families with children, or any kind of population that is considered vulnerable to harm. Sometimes that's elderly, sometimes that's people with certain mental disabilities. It really can vary from state to state, or province to province, or municipality, or the country that you're in. I'll give you some examples from here in the US, and I think this can apply pretty generally wherever you are in the world, but of course your local laws and regulations apply. So the typical way that agencies do background checks on volunteers and staff is through a law enforcement agency, usually here in the States or in California, a state Department of Justice or the federal Department of Justice. And that includes fingerprinting or live scan fingerprinting and background checks, sometimes a social security number. So this can be a barrier for a few reasons. And this is why I want you to really make sure you really need a background check for the roles of volunteers that you're doing, and what that kind of sense of safety balance versus security theater or real results is by incorporating background checks. So be very clear to staff and employees getting background checks exactly what you're looking for in a background or arrest record or convictions, and what doesn't matter. Most of the time, agencies are looking for a history of violence or theft, or occasionally if someone's driving for an agency, then they're looking at a driving record. Have there been any DUIs or license suspensions? Sometimes arson or theft, or in animal welfare, again, violence or animal cruelty, a history of that usually eliminates candidates. But that can be very stressful if volunteers don't know what you're looking for, and they're worried about a parking ticket from 5 years ago or a speeding ticket in another state from 10 years ago. So just make it really clear what you're screening for, what you expect for a background and experience of volunteers, positive, and not to have things on a negative list, but what you're positively looking for and what will eliminate someone as a candidate. And also make it very clear who takes on the cost of the background check, because realistically Most barriers to volunteering are economic. People don't have the money or the time to take a volunteering position if it's going to cost them a lot of money out of pocket, or to drive there, or gas money, or parking fees, or bus fare, or whatever it is. But for background checks, those can run $25, $50, sometimes $100, depending on what kind of records you're looking for when you do it through a Department of Justice or similar type of law enforcement agency. So that can be a pretty big expense. Just understand that if you're asking volunteers to pay for and go through the process of a background check themselves, making an appointment for fingerprinting, all of that, that eliminates a lot of people, not because they're worried about something you're going to find in their past, but that's a time hassle, and that's an expense that they can't afford. If you are able to put a budget item of covering background checks for certain volunteer roles that are necessary, again, like working with kids or elderly or other legally considered vulnerable populations, medically vulnerable, etc., then just make it clear, because if someone can afford $100 background check, that's going to eliminate a lot of people who otherwise would be great volunteers and have no type of criminal history that you're worried about, but they just don't have the time and the money to go through with it. So that's the main barrier to background checks. You also will find that sometimes agencies rely too much on a background check, and they don't take other screening or safety measures into account. So background checks are, again, one tool in the toolbox. It's not perfect. It doesn't mean that you will never have an incident of harm or harassment or crime committed by the person who's been through the background check, whether, again, paid or unpaid on your team. It's just one of the tools in the toolbox, and there should be other measures like no adult volunteer or staff is alone with a vulnerable client. There's a second adult with them, or a family member is with them if they're with a minor, or there's a teacher or some other representative. So there are kind of some common safety policies, especially working with youth and kids around the laws and regulations here in the US, that hopefully your agency is also adopting, and not just, oh, background check and we're done. Background checks are also an imperfect safety tool, which is why I want other safety measures, because a lot of people who are doing bad things to other people and causing harm are often really good at not getting caught. And we've seen that in a lot of scandals with formerly trusted institutions like the Boy Scouts of America over the years, with a lot of child abuse and exploitation charges that have been brought some years ago. But there's also an aspect of understanding these safety measures should all be part of the tools in your toolbox, and not to rely heavily on just background checks by themselves. Statistically, it's also important to understand, and I've taught a course on this with my previous agency and my coworkers. We actually taught a really intricate course on how to spot potential predators, people who wanted to harm others, especially children, but really kind of looking for more subtle signs of that harmful or predatory or abusive behavior. But statistically, a person who's most likely to, unfortunately, this is a sad statistic, harm a child is someone who's in their own family, very close to the family, known and trusted by the family or the child, or is a known and trusted authority figure. So quite often faith leaders, and again, the issue with scouts that has since been fixed and resolved, but there can be an expectation of stranger danger, and statistically, unfortunately, that's just not the case. So it's more often someone close to the child who is potentially going to abuse them or cause them harm. And that comes into play, I won't get into it in this video, with whether or not your agency staff are considered mandated reporters, working with school children regularly, working with kids and families as a government agency. That's a whole separate layer. But for background checks, one of the ways you can do background checks fairly easily is there are several services that kind of pull together public records without violating privacy. And they have a database of, is this volunteer in a database of people who are already cleared, or you can send these agencies, these private companies, a batch of people and have them do the background checks. And it typically, because it's done in a larger group, it's not as expensive as an individual going to a sheriff's department or Department of Justice background check one-on-one. There's also been some developments in the last few years, which is really helpful and kind of interesting and exciting, where volunteer management software systems easily either plug into these background check services, or they have their own services that they plug into law enforcement for you. So sometimes there's a module in your VMS, your volunteer management software, that can help you do this, and you can ask whichever company you're using as a VMS if they have that feature. And if you ask them enough and they don't have it, maybe that's something they'll add to it. As a Gen Xer myself, I grew up with a lot of stranger danger, and so it's very interesting to me that we've come to a point in society where we have Lyft and Uber and all these services where through apps we're used to interacting with strangers quite a bit, who aren't necessarily background checked. So again, the danger isn't necessarily strangers or new people, it's someone who's working to establish trust with an organization or trust with a family or an elder person that has become their target of harm or harassment. It's really important to your organizational community trust that your background check or screening process is transparent and honest. It's not biased against certain groups. There's a lot of very bigoted hate directed at the LGBTQIA plus community that is unfounded. Again, statistically, abusers or predators are typically, they consider themselves straight, they're usually male, they're usually cisgendered. That's just the math of it, unfortunately. And it's really inappropriate and breaks trust in the community if you're banning, say, a certain group or certain population from volunteering with you, whether background checks are involved or not. So make sure that you're not adding a bias or a bigotry to who and what roles and volunteers get background checked, that it's fair, that it's equitable, that it's accessible. And when you have a very transparent background check policy that's communicated internally to other departments so they'll understand how staff and volunteers are background checked, and to the community at large, that does help to build trust. And that comes into my 3 C's of happy volunteers or a happy team: comfort, convenience, connection. That connection is founded on trust and the sense that we're all in this together. And also make sure that you have a follow-through policy. So if there is an incident, that there's a way for people to safely report it and not feel like there could be quid pro quo for, say, harassment or anything like that, or any other kind of harm, and that there's a neutral way for people to report an incident, and that there is, again, a fair and equitable and within civil rights and within the laws of your local area or country, that things are investigated in a way that helps victims understand that they can safely come forward. Again, the justice departments and the incarceration and justice system in the United States is very, very biased. It's very racist. It's based on a lot of old systems, and certain populations of people are overrepresented in the incarceration and justice system in at least the United States. That's true in several other countries as well. So when you are designing background checks, make sure you understand the who, you understand the why, and you make the whole process of cost and what kind of time commitment is involved very clear to everyone involved, so that you can ideally get the most diversity of volunteers joining your organization, joining your cause, joining your team. So I hope you've enjoyed these 15-ish minutes of Tuesday tips on background checks today, and we'll be back next week with more Tuesday tips. If you have ideas about Tuesday tips, or you want to share your own video of Tuesday tips for anything around community or volunteer engagement or nonprofit advice, let me know, and I'll have some resources on some of the companies and services that are pretty good at doing volunteer background checks. I'll put those links in the video description below, and we'll see you next time with more Tuesday tips. Take care.